This tutorial is on the muscles of the posterior abdominal wall. So you've got 5 muscles that you need to know about here. You've got the quadratus lumborum, you've got the psoas major and minor, you've got the iliacus, and you've got the diaphragm. So the psoas major and minor sit kind of medially, the iliacus is inferiorly, and the diaphragm sits at the top superiorly. And then you've got the quadratus lumborum sitting kind of posteriorly and laterally. So this view that we're looking at here, I've removed the anterior abdominal muscles, and I've removed the muscles of the back and the spine, so we can view these posterior abdominal walls quite nicely. So we'll start off with these medial muscles, the psoas major and minor. So this muscle here, this large muscle, is the psoas major, and you can see its attachment here on the vertebral bodies. So it attaches from the vertebral bodies from T12 down to L5. And if I fade away the other muscles, you can see its insertion on the lesser trochanter of the femur. So you can see its origins here. It sits anterolaterally on the vertebral body, so it sits in front of the transverse processes on the bodies of vertebra T12 down to L5, and it serves to, it's a hip flexor, so it flexes the thigh at the hip joint, so it brings the thigh up like this. And also in the lying position, if you imagine this model in the supine position, the muscle can sort of act in the reverse way, so it can flex the vertebra. So it can, if it's in the supine position, the psoas major can contract to bring the vertebra up like this. So flexion at the flexion of the vertebral column rather. So the psoas minor sits on top of it, and this muscle isn't always present in everybody. But if it is present, it originates on the bodies of T12 and L1, and it inserts on the pectineal line and the iliopubic eminence. So you can see that here. So I've just isolated the muscle, and you can see its origin on T12 and L1, and it inserts on the iliopubic eminence and the pectineal line. So the psoas major is innervated by the anterior rami of spinal nerves L1 to L3, and the psoas minor is innervated by the anterior rami or ramus of L1. So the psoas minor acts as a weak flexor of the vertebral column. So if I just get rid of these two muscles now, we can take a look at the iliacus, which sits just a little bit inferior to it. So the iliacus muscle sits in the iliac fossa, and it joins the psoas muscle to insert onto the lesser trochanter. So you can see its insertion on the lesser trochanter here, and you can see how it runs through and combines with the psoas major muscle. So collectively, the iliacus and the psoas major are referred to as the iliopsoas. So this serves the same function as the psoas major muscle, so it flexes the hip at the thigh joint, sorry, the thigh at the hip joint, and it's innervated by the femoral nerve. So you can see how both the distal ends of the iliacus and psoas major pass underneath this ligament, the inguinal ligament, to insert onto the lesser trochanter of the femur. So if we just rotate round to the back, we can see the quadratus lumborum muscle, which is this muscle here. So if I just fade away the other muscles, we'll take a look at its origin and insertion. So you can see here that it has this origin on the iliac crest, and it also has an origin on the transverse process of lumbar vertebra L5. And it also, if I rotate anteriorly, you can see this ligament connecting the lumbar vertebra to the inside of the ilium. So this is called the iliolumbar ligament, and it also originates on this ligament. And it's not shown very clearly on this model, but the quadratus lumborum muscle actually inserts onto the transverse processes of lumbar vertebra L1 to L4, so it inserts here, here, here and here, as well as the inferior margin of the 12th rib. So this muscle can laterally flex the spine, and it can also depress the rib. And this muscle is innervated by the anterior rami of T12 and also of L1 to L4, spinal nerves T12 and L1 to L4. So right at the top we've got the diaphragm. So the posterior parts of the diaphragm contribute to the posterior abdominal wall, the muscular parts of the posterior abdominal wall. So we'll just take a quick look at the diaphragm. So you can see it's got this domed shape, and it separates the thorax from the abdomen, so the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity, and it forms the superior aspect of the abdominal cavity, so it lines the inferior thoracic aperture. And it's attached to the lumbar vertebra by these two sort of legs. So these two legs are called crura, plural, or crus, singular. So this is Latin for leg, and you've got a right and a left crus. And if I rotate the model around, you can see that there's this central tendinous section, and there's a few holes, so various structures pass from the thorax into the abdominal cavity via these holes. So there's a lot to talk about with the diaphragm, but I won't go through all that. I'll do a separate tutorial. So it's the posterior parts of the diaphragm that contribute to the posterior abdominal wall, the muscular part of the posterior abdominal wall, and the diaphragm is innervated by the phrenic nerve. So those are the 5 muscles you need to know that make up the posterior abdominal wall. You've got the diaphragm at the top, the posterior parts of the diaphragm, you've got the serratus major and minor, you've got the iliacus, and you've got the quadratus lumborum.